conscious that it's getting to the end of the conference, but we have a lot to get through in this session. I'd like to introduce our panel, starting with Richard Heath, who is joining us online. Richard Heath is the Chief Executive Officer of Australia's largest cooperative research centre, Zero Net Emissions Agriculture CRC. His extensive experience in the Australian agriculture sector extends across multiple high-profile roles, including the Executive Director with the Australian Farm Institute. He's an Associate Professor of Agronomy and Farm Management at the University of Sydney and the Director at Nuffield Australia Farming Scholars. He's a Non-Executive Director of the Grains Research and Development Corporation. Thanks for joining us online, Richard. I know that you had intended to be here in person, but like so many of the delegates that were here yesterday, some were here this morning, there's a bit happening nationally, whether it is a cyclone in Brisbane or ecological disaster in Tasmania, which we may touch on in this panel, among many of the other really important agricultural issues that are unfolding nationally and also globally. With us in person on the panel is Chris Stevens. He's the Director of Global Agribusiness Calanova. He's been working in the fast-moving consumer goods industry for more than 30 years, covering product development and innovation, brand marketing, national sales, commodity trading and procurement, including leading in the Asia, Middle East and Africa Regional Procurement Organisation. Much of his career has been with the Kellogg company, which is now Calanova. I'm really gripping up these bios because, as you'll see when we get into the discussion, bios just don't do these panelists justice. With us also is Angela Williamson. She's the Director of Blue Policy and Planning at the Blue Economy CRC. Angela is a passionate leader in the ocean governance, bringing her over 20 years of experience spanning government, politics, business, and research sectors. Her notable achievements include co-designing the Futures of Seafood study and spearheading the first aquaculture research trial in the Commonwealth waters. During the COVID-19 pandemic, she drove the development of the International Freight Assistance Mechanism, providing crucial support to the seafood industry. And that's really important to note because there's some big firsts for Australia in there. Sue McCluskey is Australia's inaugural Special Representative for Australian Agriculture, with an increasing focus on more environmentally sustainable production. Sue works to promote and demonstrate Australia's commitment to climate-smart, sustainable agriculture and counter prescriptive policy that could negatively impact Australian agriculture and global food security. But I think for everybody in this room and joining us online, as well as those working across the entire agriculture system and sector, I think we could sum up Sue's job as being the one that everybody wants. I'm going to throw to our keynote, to set the scene for this discussion. Dr. Will Chancellor is going to help us really understand not only the data, but the picture that it paints. Will is the director of the ABARES productivity section and an applied economist. His research focus at ABARES includes productivity and efficiency analysis, farmland prices, R&D investment, farm resilience, nature capital, and climate change. Much of his work is published in journals, book chapters, and ABARES reports. And I'm really keen to get this session underway, so I'm going to hand over to you, Will.
Okay, good afternoon everyone, and thanks for the introduction, Kate. Productivity has been an important part of the agricultural growth story. It's been about producing more with less, maximising outputs while minimising inputs. Increasingly though, the story is shifting. It's becoming more about reducing the environmental impact, farming in a sustainable way, and a vision towards net zero. So sustainable productivity growth is still about producing more with less, but it's about doing so while minimizing the negative environmental impact. So in driving sustainability, we don't want to forget about why productivity matters. First, productivity indicates whether farms are getting better at converting their inputs into outputs, reflecting things like improvements in management practices and optimizing scale and technology adoption and so on. So through reductions in inputs, leaner management practices, and the use of cleaner, more modern technology, productivity can grow and the environmental impact can be reduced. So when productivity is growing, it reflects an agricultural industry that is becoming increasingly optimized and underpinned by a robust innovation system. And finally, more productive farms are somewhat insulated from price volatility. So fewer inputs reduces their exposure to input price shocks, and more outputs usually leads to more revenue. So there is this sort of important linkage between farm productivity and farm profit. ABARES has a long history of publishing high-quality insights, and total factor productivity continues to be one of our core measures. This is really about how well farms are converting their inputs, so land, labor, capital, materials, and services, into outputs, so crops, livestock, wool, milk, and other things. And so each year, ABARES updates these productivity estimates and by farm type and by region, and makes them freely available for use and download. So climate change expanded our thinking to develop estimates of climate-adjusted productivity. We know that farm productivity is sensitive to climate. The idea behind climate-adjusted productivity is to observe those underlying improvements in productivity due to innovation adoption and management skill and scale and R&D and those things, without that sort of noisy climate effect and those seasonal fluctuations. But next we wanted to do more. Now we're looking to measure sustainable productivity by trying to capture emission outputs. So our plan is to measure sustainable productivity by developing estimates of emission-adjusted productivity. So it's all about producing more through productivity growth, but ensuring this is done in a sustainable way without impacting the environment and natural conditions negatively. And so we're currently working through some of the technical details to develop these estimates for use. Okay, so how does it all look? Well, the long-term trend for broadacre productivity has increased. Farms are doing much better now than they were in the late 80s. We know that productivity has become increasingly volatile. And as you can see here, major drought years interrupt productivity significantly in the short term. And in more recent years, from around 2010-11, average productivity growth in broadacre has slowed. So our climate-adjusted productivity estimates untangle the effect of climate from farm productivity. And once climate is taken out, you can see that much of that volatility in the short term is gone. And what's left is that long-term increase in productivity becomes clearer, as does the slowdown since around 2010-11. Now next, I want to show you something new and experimental. So the story is becoming more about sustainable productivity. And while it's still being developed, emission-adjusted productivity will become our indicator of sustainable productivity. We have some very early experimental estimates here on the chart for national broadacre. When it's all ready for public use, this measure will help to inform policy around the balance between maximising farm productivity and minimising the negative environmental impact. As the work progresses, estimates will be developed by broadacre type, region, and to allow us to explore differences and nuances in sustainable productivity spatially and by enterprise type. This level of detail could feed into targeted evidence-based policy making on sustainable productivity. So once we have a proven measure for sustainable productivity, we will be able to inform decisions around the balance between growing agriculture and environmental stewardship for a prosperous future. Thank you.
Thanks, Will. I very purposely didn't talk too much about what we were going to discuss on this panel because I, as I said, wanted to get straight into it. And that is a great segue to Sue McCluskey now. Before we go to some other panellists.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks, everyone. Great to be here. I'm actually going to do the segue between Will and the panel itself. And as Kate says, I've got the best gig in town, so I'm going to use pictures because I think a picture tells 1,000 words. So let me just pick up on some of the themes that we've heard over the last couple of days and share with you what I'm hearing globally, seeing domestically, and then what this means for industry. Globally, look, we have heard that will there continue to be a focus on the SDGs? I believe there will. For a lot of those countries that we trade with, and particularly in the Indo-Pacific, the SDGs will continue to be important, and so will the SDGs in terms of underpinning food security. We know that everyone's been talking about it, the ESGs, corporate reporting has been focused on ESG, and we know that climate-related financial disclosures have already come into place. We've got the largest corporates reporting on them, and 30 of our trading nations are reporting on climate. So if we think whatever's happening globally and with all of those headwinds we're seeing, it's going to make a big difference. Industry is way out ahead of government, and they are doing this. We've got the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and this is all being driven by the finance sector. And the finance sector really is what underpins, of course, capital and investment. Domestically, we've got our net zero by 2050 plans, of which the agriculture and land sector is one of those 6 sectoral plans. And the work being undertaken on that in terms of co-design will continue. We've got market mechanisms that have been introduced. Our ACCU system, our carbon credit system, is an incentive to try and get farmers to be able to price, to be able to measure and then price carbon. You've also got biodiversity credits coming in. So we're seeing a lot more move towards biodiversity and carbon and net zero and emissions measurements. We have, of course, heard quite a lot about the Australian Sustainability Framework. Fantastic framework. What does this mean on the ground? It is all the industry-specific sustainability frameworks that are what each industry actually follows. I talk up the overarching agricultural sustainability framework in global markets. For a farmer on the ground, and I'm a farmer myself, I refer to the beef sustainability framework because that's what gives me guidance in terms of how I measure. Some of the big things I see coming, and this is really important because this is actually quite new. We're doing a lot of work around natural capital. There's been a lot of work around measurement, natural capital accounting. What this is doing is actually putting natural capital onto the balance sheet. There was the Global Nature Positive Summit in Sydney last year. This was the opportunity to showcase what Australia is doing in this place. And because of that, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures and the Capitals Coalition System, which is a global network which brings together financial capital, social capital, natural capital, is now going to invest in Australia and set up an Australian chapter to really be able to focus on what we're doing here and elevate the work we're doing in Australian agriculture around natural capital and measurements. This will actually be formally announced at Climate Week in a couple of weeks' time, but I was allowed to share this with you. So what does this mean for us? Well, in terms of sustainable productivity and net zero, no disrespect, but for the farmer, a lot of the words don't actually mean anything. It's about profitability. It's about the money. You've got to put the money on the table for us. So there's got to be the value proposition that can be demonstrated right the way along the supply chain. It's all very well to say this is good for the planet, that's the public benefit, but we've actually got to also think about that private benefit, which is why I like that natural capital work, because it is about demonstrating why it's worth investing in sustainable environmental practices, because it actually makes good sense in terms of making you more money. Along with this, we've got to think about the compliance burden, and we've got to think about how we assist farmers with that, and that's something that I think governments really need to turn their minds to. We can't keep putting more for regulatory burden on farmers, and we've got to think about how we can help them with this, and we've got to recognise there's no one size fits all. It doesn't matter which country you're in, what farming enterprise you run, what land you operate on, there will be different trajectories, there'll be different ways of doing things. And I think importantly, when it comes to net zero, we don't all have to get to net zero. It does need to be not necessarily at the sectoral level, but we've got to see how Team Australia, Australian agriculture can actually meet those goals. Thank you, and I'll finish there.
Great. We started the session with an explainer from Will of sorts, and now we've heard from Sue and really painting the picture of what's happening domestically and globally. I'd like to bring Richard in now to, there we go, we've got Richard online. And I'll throw to you, Richard, to give your insights.
Thanks, Kate. So, look, really grateful to be able to talk about this CRC. It's brand new, as you've talked about. We commenced operations 1st of July last year. Very shortly, we'll be starting to announce our first suite of research investments. Now, this CRC has been set up very specifically to provide the tools for farmers, for them to adopt practices that will help transition agriculture to net zero in a profitable and productive way. So as Sue has just talked about, and as Will was talking about in terms of that focus on productivity, we need the tools for that net zero transition that does it in a way that provides a profitability pathway for farmers so that there is an incentive to take up these new technologies and best practice systems that also continue to build productivity while lowering emissions as well. Now, I'm going to attempt to share the screen here, and I hope this works and you can see the... okay, can you see that, Kate?
Not yet, but it's a very fitting comment that you make on the back of the adoption of technology and how we use these tools.
Okay. Right, well, I'll keep
it.
talking and hopefully that slide will come up, which is the basically the plan on a page of our entire research program for the CRC. We have 4 pillars of research that we're undertaking, and they're basically plants, animals, whole farm systems, and delivering value from the whole of economy transition to net zero. Every single one of those points in there, if you can see the slide, focusing on new technologies or new practices in agriculture that have a profitability impact for farmers. So in the plants column, for instance, we're going to be doing a lot of work at looking at new pasture species that have a lower inherent methane producing potential, but also it's in a modern breeding program where the other traits in those plants in terms of increased productivity aspects are going to see an increase, just better pastures for increased productivity anyway, that also have an emissions dividend. The point 2 there that talks about novel low emissions fertilisers. Nitrous oxide emissions from fertiliser use is the second biggest greenhouse gas emitted from agriculture. Every bit of nitrous oxide that we're losing into the atmosphere is a productivity loss. It's waste. It's fertiliser that's been purchased, put into the ground or applied to crops, and then is lost to the atmosphere. So if we can develop fertiliser coatings or entirely new types of fertiliser that keeps more of that nitrogen available to the crop and less going to the atmosphere, then that's an obvious productivity and profitability increase without having those emissions going into the atmosphere. And all of those points have a similar sort of dual purpose aspect to them in that there is an emissions dividend, but they're very squarely aimed at improving farm practice for a profitability and productivity gain. Improving the genetics of animals. So in the animal pillar, for instance, we're going to be doing a lot of work just on establishing estimated breeding values for cattle and sheep because there's huge variation in genetics just in how efficiently cattle and sheep process their feed in terms of the methane that they output. Now, we can select for more methane efficient animals, which generally means selecting for more efficient animals full stop. Again, the productivity increase as well as the emissions reduction aspect to it. I'll just concentrate on the fourth pillar for a little bit, which is delivering value from net zero. And that is how we bring other aspects of the economy's transition to net zero into farm practices without replacing the existing farm business and the productivity that's embedded in that. So how do you embed, how do you bring agrivoltaics, for instance, solar, into a grazing landscape and still graze sheep, say, under solar panels? And can we do that in a way that increases the productivity of the sheep as well? And there's quite a bit of evidence that that could be the case as an example of the sorts of things that we'll be looking at in that pillar. And then the final one I'll mention, pillar 3, which is the whole farm analysis, is just all the things we need to do to be able to monitor, verify, and report on the changes that we're making so we can understand both the productivity and profitability improvement, but also the emissions reduction, and then hopefully get rewarded for that through other pathways, other revenue pathways, whether that is markets, carbon markets, or whether it's insetting programs, wherever that reward might be coming in to a farm business, that we will have the ability to do that if we can appropriately record the outputs.
I'd like to throw to Angela now to continue this conversation that we've started about sustainability, productivity, and net zero emissions. Just, I guess, a really nice segue to you, because we've just heard there about, some tools and pathways, profitability, which is going to be at the core of this, no matter which way we spin it. But you've got some points on climate, which are another huge part of this conversation.
Yeah, I guess operating in the commons, again, back to oceans, blue economy. So, of course, I'm going to be ocean focused, and shout out to probably the sprinkle of people in the audience that are also fish, seafood, ocean-related activities. But bottom line, we're operating in nature. Our regulatory system already takes into account nature. The system we have and the operators we have range from your micros and your nanos to your SMEs to your globals, your large companies. And so they're operating across the spectrum when it comes to sustainability, when it's looking at net zero, when you're looking at what solutions you might offer. Seaweed, for example, in the methane space is a small kind of pilot sitting over there as well. But bottom line, we have a mismatch at times between the sustainability conversation and that operational on-ground activity. I think sustainability as a word freaks some people out as well, I'm not going to lie. We often use responsible business, like what does it mean to be a responsible business, a responsible operator in a neighbourhood, what matters to you, matters to us, how do we position ourselves in that kind of circumstance? And then the other factor is, like all farmers, our aquaculture industry, for example, operating in nature, you touched on earlier about Tasmania. If there is a drought, if there is floods, there is a lot of community sentiment and support for industry. In the marine environment, that does not all naturally come to our farmers, our marine farmers and our fishers. We've just been through a series of marine heat waves. Got a continuation. You've got droughts. Will, I was looking at your document. Got these droughts. Let's throw in marine heat waves as well. They create, major risk for these industries, and the ability to adapt, because it's not a mitigation piece necessarily. The ability to adapt is so crucial. In the case of aquaculture, the ability to look at selective breeding programs and look at like +2 degree kind of breeding opportunities, really, really crucial. But this is an industry that is super mature in some ways. Some of these species are part of global markets. There are lessons and learnings from all over the world. But at the same time, I would love to see Australia's sustainability story that is really bespoke to Australia. We just heard earlier about the Asia connection as well. From a market perspective, we have to look at these other countries in Europe, but at the same time, I would love to see what matters and what makes sense here.
Before we open up this discussion to take questions from the floor as well as our delegates online, I'd like to throw to you, Chris, because you really round out this panel nicely in that we've had the data, we've got the research, we've got what's happening globally with those insights from Sue, as well as climate, and a lot more for everybody to discuss on all of those points. But really, you're going to talk about soil as well as some of the reports, the information from reports, including the farm to table, and over to you.
All right, thanks, Kate. So I'm going to actually take a few minutes to take you all through a real life example of what we're talking about here on farmer engagement and working with farmers around achieving reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. But before I do that, just to set the context, so Kellogg's or Kellanova Company, we're a global company, obviously. We're the world's largest manufacturer of breakfast cereals. We're also the second largest manufacturer of snacks, and we own the Pringles brand, which a lot of you probably don't know, but we actually own Pringles. So we're very much invested in our farmers and our farmer networks. And here in Australia, we've been working directly with farmers for over 100 years since we opened our first company here. So when we look at our global footprint for our GHG emissions, we break it down obviously into Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3. Our Scope 1 and Scope 2, we have complete control over. That's our factories, our logistics and our utility usage. That is 22% of our footprint. 78% of our footprint is Scope 3, which we have no control over. And 85% of that 78% is our farms, our farming network. So for us as a company to achieve net zero in 2050, we have to be working with our farmers to enable them to reduce their GHG footprint. So we have a real live example of this happening right now in New South Wales on a project of a consortium project that we're part of with Mars, PepsiCo, Nestle, Manildra, Allied Pinnacle, Corson Grains, and a number of the New South Wales farming systems groups on actually focusing on introducing or developing practices for farmers around improving soil health and reducing their GHG footprint. This particular project is actually called the Cool Soil Initiative, and it started in 2017. It actually started because there was a recognition amongst many of us who buy wheat, and we are a big wheat buyer here in New South Wales, that there was a gradual, very slow decrease in yield across wheat in New South Wales. And when you consider the tonnes of wheat that New South Wales produces, 7% reduction in yield is pretty significant. Why was that happening? A lot of it was around soil health. A lot of it was around mining of N in the soil. And a lot of it was around loss of organic carbon levels, which also had an impact on the amount of moisture that the soil was holding. So Mars approached us and said, hey, would you like to get interested in working in this project where we start to look at ways that we can work with farmers to turn around and improve their soil health and look at trying to offset this yield drag. So we started the project, as I said, in 2017. We started with farmers in the Riverine Plains farming systems groups, in the Central West, in the irrigation areas down south, and now we've branched out into southern Queensland and into northern Victoria. The focus was on wheat because wheat was the primary crop, but we've now expanded into corn, into canola, and we're looking at potentially a couple of other cool crops coming on later on during the year. What we have done is not rocket science. All we have done is got farmers to refocus on some of the basic elements of good farming practice. Minimum till, cover cropping, deep liming because our soils are acidic and we really want these guys to try to get a pulse rotation in. So if we get deep liming into there, we can lift the pH up a bit and we can get a pulse rotation, which then enables them to fix a bit of nitrogen out of the air. Undertake a good nitrogen utilisation efficiency program, so stop throwing N on the crop. That is a big part of what we were trying to do here. Farmers put too much N on because they were seeing a yield drag. Oh, it's not green enough, let me put a bit more N on there and that'll boost my yields up. Well, it doesn't work that way. Unfortunately, all they're doing is throwing money onto the field. So by getting their N under control, that enables them to reduce some input costs, because we all know what the price of N has been like lately, and that helps with their profitability. So when you start stacking all these practices up together and getting farmers engaged with it, we started to see some really positive results. So as I said, this has been running since 2017. And that, you think from 2017 to 2025, we've had 2 years of drought, 1 year of floods, 3 decent years, and probably 1 good year. So we've had the full gambit of everything that could possibly hit us in terms of what would happen to our crops. We have seen a gradual increase in soil organic carbon in the farmers that have been part of our program, and we've got about 200 farmers now. There's 197,000 hectares under cool soil. So we started to see organic carbon levels coming up, but for us as corporates, more importantly, their GHG emissions are starting to come down. So we're heading in the right direction, both in helping them improve their soil health and helping them to reduce their GHG footprint. What does this also mean for the farmer? We have a lot of farmer meetings. We go out, we like to talk to them to understand what they're feeling, how they think the project's running. What they really like about this is future-proofing them on when the government comes to them and starts asking questions around what their carbon footprint looks like at the farm level. These guys are going to be able to say, I've got 5 years worth of data here. Would you like to have a look at what my footprint looks like? So we utilise something called the Cool Farm tool. It's a globally utilised tool, which is the only tool that is measuring on-farm GHG emissions. So we're measuring from the farm level up, not from the top down. So we're getting actual data from the farm, which the farmers own, and able to roll that up to get a consolidated figure. So that's a real life project that's happening right now. As I said, it's a great consortium. It's an end-to-end supply chain, so it goes all the way from the farmer all the way through. Eventually, we're going to have the retailers involved with this as well, and so we'll get it right through to the consumer.
I want to throw to Richard on the back of your comments there. And I guess you've just painted this picture of a case study, but it could also be an example of the investment that you've shown in farmers to future-proof their ability to report and maintain that governance. But where do farming businesses that are not within these consortiums or co-ops, where do they access this kind of support to future-proof them if it's not through incentivisation of the government?
Is this to Richard?
Richard.
Sure. So look, it's very confusing for farmers at the moment to see where the incentives might be getting delivered from when you've got lots of different opportunities, either through, if we're talking carbon, through official methodologies through the Emissions Reduction Fund. We've got increasing, as Sue talked about before, signals from the finance sector and from supply chains in terms of the pressure to inset just to remain part of a supply chain. We've also got alternative markets opening up for nature positive and biodiversity and that sort of thing. So there is an absolute array of opportunities that a lot of them aren't very mature yet and not necessarily something you can really grab onto and get a tangible result out of, but a lot of talk about these things that are coming and how you position yourselves to be able to make sense of where the opportunities are in those sorts of markets is really difficult. So, what I really recommend, and I think, you hear it over and over again, and as we've just heard now, to make sense of where the opportunities are as they emerge more and more, you've got to have the numbers. You've got to be doing the measurement on farm. You've got to be at least knowing what your position is to then make a careful assessment on the appropriate pathway to take to get some reward. One of the things, and that's again still not particularly easy, and one of the things that the CRC is going to be investing heavily in is measurement methodologies, because a lot of the opportunities that are going to emerge out of new practice, particularly for emissions reduction, which is obviously the space that we're playing in, the more that we can get better real measurements of that rather than relying on modelling, which is really all we can do at the moment. I think the more confidence that there will be from farmers in particular, but just generally from the market in terms of the level of rigour in the practice change and the methods that might come out of those. And it's really important for things like genetics in animals, for instance, like a genetic change. So if you're going to go and pay thousands and thousands of dollars for a new bull that has an estimated breeding value that is more methane efficient, virtually every other breeding value that you would pay money for in a bull, you can measure in some way. Like, if it's just weight gain, you can measure over the scales. If it's meat quality, you can get that data back. For methane emissions, it's modelling. We're assuming that you're going to get that result until we can get better measurement methodologies in the field to at least ground truth and further develop those models so that you know that you're getting the outcome.
I want to bring you in.
Yeah, Kate, I might just add a bit to that. I think it's great that Richard, the CRC is actually going to be looking at methodologies. But if I go back probably 12 to 18 months, maybe even a bit longer, I would have to say that there was a lot of confusion because there were a whole lot of different tools, and to be honest, particularly at the farmer level, and these are ones that are not in that supply chain where they're getting assistance, they were saying, how do I pick the snake oil tool from what is the tool that's actually going to be something that's accepted? And I think government started to have a look at whether should they start to develop tools. But in the end, it was a realisation. As I said, the private sector's way out ahead. There are a lot of tools out there. So what government's doing, and it's being done through the Department of Climate Change, is to develop standards that will then start to be able to give farmers and others in the private sector the assurance so that they can then choose what is the right tool for them. It might be an add-on to their accounting software. It might be an add-on to something else they use. It allows them to make a choice but know that it can be verified.
I want to throw to you, Will, because I'm just wondering, how does this, the amount of tools, the methodology that's available, how does this impact and influence your ability to measure this data and analyse it? And I guess just an add-on to that, what are you seeing globally in some of these trends that stand out?
Yeah, it's a great question, and all of the speakers have really touched on it. This whole issue around getting good data to back up the research with robust methodologies and proper research. And Australia, I see in say attending OECD meetings and so on, you can see that Australia's a standout leader in farm data. The ABARES farm survey data, for example, has been going for decades and decades. It's a real national treasure, and you can do some really significant analysis with it, as we've shown. So I think, the sort of work that Richard and others are doing to try and build capacity in data collection and really strong methodologies is, a real kind of cornerstone of having good research.
Are we at a bit of a turning point with this in terms of, we're having some changes in methodology or being able to really get quality data that may have been a little bit harder to achieve previously?
Yes, I suppose so. So a lot of the emissions data that Richard's talking about, it's really difficult to capture. You can't just go and ask a farmer, as you would say there, how much debt or whatever. I suppose the other side to that is to call out the bad research and where numbers have been inferred or modelled too far, and to look to make sure none of that sort of research is being used for policy making, and to make sure it's all backed up by proper, robust data and methodology.
I'd like to bring you in now, Angela. Just, I guess, what your observations of ESG are and how that's being applied in Australia within your sector.
Yeah, so I used to work for the Department of Environment, federal, back in the day, 13 years, and I thought I knew what sustainability was. Then went and worked in political offices, both Libs and Labor, and thought I knew what, economic drivers were, and worked for Cricket Australia and thought I knew what sport was. And find myself like at Tassal in a corporate role where, oh my God, I worked out what sustainability really was, because it was driven by market and shareholders, and there was governance around it, and there were expectations. And even if I was doing A, someone else was doing B. And I think ESG became real, and I looked back at a lot of what I've done in my past, and I'm now in the CRC atoning for my sins when I thought that sustainability meant A, when actually it is not about, me leading a team of 6 people in one of, Australia's largest seafood companies, playing responsible business and sustainability reporting to investors. And, it actually was about touching every corner of that business and ensuring that every staff member played a role. Touched on this yesterday with one of my conversations with someone where I talked about ESG to become real had to be translated to language that made sense to everybody, and that's where responsible business came into play. Sustainability reporting became BAU. Everyone was doing it. 12 years of that meant F all, what's that next bit? So the ability to find areas to accelerate and then commit to that next stage. And then, you talked about finance, being able to do sustainability linked loans became a really critical piece. And all of a sudden you are navigating all the architecture and you are placing it and putting it together. But at the end of the day, where we made a difference in ESG was toolbox meetings with staff every morning about what their role was, what reporting looked like, what accountability looked like. I'm going to use marine debris as an example. Marine debris is a significant issue if you're working in the ocean. Majority of marine debris comes from land-based activities. But in the marine space, if a piece of gear gets off a piece of infrastructure or an installation, and someone hits it on a boat, they can die, they can drown. There's a life and death element. So marine debris became not just a waste-related reportable piece, it had a safety element. So at that point, the company knew that they were contributing 27% of marine debris that was coming up on beaches. That was found out through a beach cleanup program that had regular engagement. And so the task was put to the staff, not acceptable, we're going to reduce it. So incentive programs came into play, and that allowed different areas to compete against one another. And I found out what they like are food trucks. And so you bring in incentive regimes, it helps us with our reporting, with our broader accountability. Everyone has a responsibility. Got it down lower. Next thing, if everyone, rather than side by side, if everyone can meet this next target, you get a Helly Hansen jacket, right? And so then again, we got down to below 5%, with the target of 0. And marine debris is not necessarily emissions, but it is a waste stream. And so the ability to have that accountability within a business, to bring together different areas that don't automatically want to talk sustainability or ESG, to give them a reward, accountability, and help them design your acceleration program or those other areas is crucial. Otherwise, you are disconnected, and it is something that sits in the ivory tower of headquarters, and it is for reporting for investors, or it is a response to a media request. All of a sudden it became real and accountable, and that's when you get wins.
Chris, I really want to come back to you for the global company lens on that. But first I want to throw to Sue, just on something that Angela said there about incentivisation. What happens though when you take away incentivisation from farmers to bring on some of these compensation to adopt these practices?
So it's actually a really interesting lesson to learn if we look global, and it picks up a bit, perhaps in your earlier question around global data. So if I look around the world, let me pick on the EU. So the EU under their Green Deal Farm to Fork they say that they have moved their subsidies to be more environmentally focused because they can pay their farmers to actually gather the data and report. They're getting buy-in there. Now, let me be honest here, I call that out as a bit of greenwashing. I wouldn't say that they're necessarily environmentally focused. The UK, however, is transitioning post-Brexit from subsidies, and they are actually doing a pretty good job of repurposing as part of their transition program towards better environmental outcomes. Their farmers are still not happy because, of course, a bucket of money has been taken away and it will move off over the next 5 years. But they are able to get data being collected, but it's been driven more by the retailers there. We've got to remember that our farmers are not subsidised here. So there's got to be either some sort of incentive, whether that be through a price premium, whether that be through some sort of increase in profitability, or whether that be through some sort of better practice that is actually going to drive behavioural change. Now, I'll give you an example from my farm. 33 years ago, when it came to fertiliser use, I used to put superphosphate on every year and lime every 5 years. In the last 8 years I've been soil sampling. It was a subsidised program by the New South Wales government. It not only meant that I was actually getting soil sampling at a cheaper rate, but it was also supported by workshops that taught me about understanding my soil profile better. Have a guess at how much I've reduced my fertiliser use. 100%. So it makes sense for me to actually think about that. So when it comes back to your point about what are you calling it, I don't think about that as being a sustainability outcome. It actually is. I'm saving money, but in the end, I'm actually doing more for the environment. So we've actually got to think about incentives through the eyes of the users, not what we think is going to motivate them.
I'm going to stay with you now because I've also got a question that I wrote down rapidly while hearing all of you speak earlier. And you just touched on it there of, I guess, the benefits for you having these practices. If we are winding back incentives for adoption, is there a discussion to be had with farmers, and maybe it's a national discussion through a global lens perhaps, but what is the cost of not having sustainable practices, having productivity and meeting those net zero targets?
And I think that's a really important conversation. So when I speak to industry, I'll say, look, to be honest, I don't think we're going to get a price premium for a lot of this because it would just be baked into the expectations that consumers will have in terms of how they think that we need to produce. But what is the cost of not doing this? Are we going to be locked out of markets? Are we actually going to get a price discount? So we've actually got to be thinking about that. But I will actually go back to what you said about winding back on incentives. And I think in a broader environment where we are needing to move and move very quickly to encourage industry to take up measurement and reporting and also to demonstrate our credentials, particularly globally, that I think government is going to need to think about what incentives may need to be put into the system, even if they're short-term incentives. They may be through the tax system that will actually help to bring people along and get that sort of behavioural change that we need to do in the short term. We can't wait for the longer term.
Chris, Sue didn't even touch on soil health there. She alluded to it.
She
But
did.
I want to throw to you on the soil health benefits.
Sure. So before we do that, just one more bit on incentives, because it is a very emotional topic that a lot of people get very worked up about. My role is global, so I have projects happening all over the world. And as a rule, I don't pay any incentives. Basically because it does not drive practice change that we have found. What we try to do is create value propositions for farmers through changes in the practices which actually deliver benefits for them. So we talk about reduction in their N, money in their back pocket. We talk about minimum tillage, money in their pocket. We talk about improving their cash flow, particularly important for smallholder farmers because they want their cash to get the next crop in the ground really quickly. So we work with finance groups to make sure they're getting a cash flow, or we work with whoever's buying the crop from them to make sure they pay them in 7 days or 14 days. So we look for alternative methods to bring profitability to farmers. My number one goal in terms of my farmer engagement is to make sure they make more money by working with me. Okay, I'm not out there to make farmers lose money. I'm out there to make farmers get more money. So, but it's how we do that creatively that instills the practice change and ensures that it carries on when I'm not out there working with them in the field. So, coming back to soil health, I should have mentioned before that part of Cool Soil is that we provide soil testing for every one of our farmers. That is a really important piece in this because A, we pay for it, so it's a cost saving for the farmers, but B, we give them continual data and continual feedback on what's happening with their soil health. If you start to increase the organic carbon levels in your soil, you enable the soil to hold more moisture. It's a part of our drought proofing methodology. If, you know, when you're running at 0.7% organic carbon, which a lot of farmers are running at, that's not holding much moisture in there. If you're up at 2%, 2.5%, even 3%, we've got some farmers running at now, that starts to really hold water in there, helps you in terms of drought proofing you a little bit. We heard a comment, I can't remember which session I was sitting in, about some dryness in the Wimmera and in the Mallee, that they had managed to increase their soil organic carbon levels up through some work they were doing, and they got 1 tonne in this current dry cropping season where they'd got nothing before. So soil health, it's a basic tenet for us in terms of our farmer engagement. We look at soil health as a primary way of driving productivity benefits. Varieties and varietal development only takes you so far. If you want to go up to the next level of getting productivity in your farm, you need to be concentrating on getting your soil right.
I'm very conscious of the time and I would love to be able to throw to the floor for some questions. So if anybody is feeling like they've got enough energy at this hour in the day to put their hand up, that would be great. Yep, we'll go straight to the front. If we could get a microphone, please, to table 10. And while we're waiting for that, I'll throw to Angela. What does good soil health on land mean for marine waters? And how does that assist in ESG governance, data, reporting, but also health?
Yeah, I think I'm going to use Queensland as a bit of an example there, and the reef and the catchments and the aquaculture operations who alongside sugarcane and a variety of other land-based ag are experiencing exactly the same restrictions, opportunities, and working with, you know, we talked earlier about working with multiple departments and having to work under, in the Queensland sense, DESI, and the previous governments, a lot of their regulatory changes and what was put in place. What it has done though is it's actually meant that the decisions that made at that point has meant that despite Queensland having a growth plan for aquaculture, there is no ability to grow necessarily in those areas that are adjacent to the Great Barrier Reef, for example, irrespective of all the great work that's been done by industries who are working alongside there, because of the net zero expectations on effluent discharge. And so these two go hand in hand, they absolutely do. Part of my program is also looking at an area that is not being used at the moment when it comes to, let's say, aquaculture. This area is being used by wild fisheries, it is being used by a lot of other industries, and that's offshore. So at the moment, you can only do aquaculture in state waters out to 3 nautical miles. There is no regulatory basis from 3 to 200. Really large part of Australia that potentially could play a really important role in provision of seafood, co-location with other activities, whether that's wind arrays, whether that's part of the decommissioning of oil and gas. And so another element is, you know, the ability to go further offshore without compromising the existing estate within state waters. The relationships between land-based and marine are really, really well known from a research perspective, but not necessarily always brought together in lobbying, advocacy, and engagement with government on shared objectives. And I think a lot of it is done in some levels, but it doesn't always actually benefit and flow down to the individual companies. But whatever comes out of drainage has an impact on the ocean. And, we touched on earlier, there was a session about aid, the US pulling back on aid, and the whole Asia Pacific and Indo areas. And at the end of the day, having been the old Convention on Biological Diversity rep for Australia, and having Asia Pacific under my environment basis, it was always about healthy oceans underpin livelihoods and food security. And as a bundle, it works. Pull one of those pieces out and you've got a destabilised community and society. So the collaborations, let's make them stronger, I think is part of it. The role of government in that space, stop siloing. There are bits where silos don't work. But we've been there back in the late 90s and early 2000s, and then we divorced, then we came back, then we divorced.
You've really highlighted and exposed some of those regulatory restrictions, but also a lot of the themes that have carried over into this discussion from the one I chaired previously about securing the food system as opposed to only focusing on food production. And a lot of that discussion, really, the thread was about the collaboration and bringing together all parts of not only supply chain, but the sector, and you've touched on that with the land and sea. Question from table 10, please.
Thank you. Katie McRobert, Australian Farm Institute. Thank you for a really interesting panel. Chris, you mentioned something before that I wanted to pick up as a thread and throw to the entire panel to consider when you talked about the fact that you don't pay for outcomes, that you avoid those extrinsic motivators and you look for the intrinsic value and to provide that value proposition in order to get lasting change. And we know that often what drives people in this space when you're talking about sustainability is improvement against a goal. Australian farmers, in many ways, as Sue's pointed out too, very innovative in a lot of these spaces. We're really good with our conservation tillage, we're really good with our water management, rice, world leading. What happens when we get closer to those goals and we can't demonstrate improvement against a particular baseline and we don't feel like we're making progress even though we might actually be in a really good space? And thinking, Angela, about what you said about bringing the waste down from 27% to 5%, heading towards zero, moving from 27 to 5 feels great, moving from 5 to 4 feels like nothing, but it's still really hard work. Can the panel talk about some examples where you've come across this additionality problem and trying to still keep people motivated when the goal feels like maybe it's already behind you or maybe it's not meaningful anymore?
I want to throw to Richard first on this because I'm conscious that he's been left out in the ethos.
I think it's a really great example, Katie, of what you're talking about that's from New Zealand, that's just been released through Fonterra and their pricing structure, which essentially rewards farmers in their milk pooling schemes for being better than the average on methane emissions. So if you can demonstrate credibly that you are better than the average in the pool with the methane emissions from your herd, you get a better price for your milk from Fonterra. That is a direct incentive. And what I like about that is that it is continually being adjusted relative to the average as the industry improves. So it's continually driving that improvement and it's an incentive to keep doing better. Now, it takes a pretty progressive organisation in a space like that to realise what they need to do to move the entire industry. But I get the feeling that you're going to see more and more of that happening, particularly with those, really big businesses and supply chains that just look at ways of incentivising their supply chains to make them move.
Sue?
Perhaps 2 points, Katie, I'll make. One is I think it's great what Fonterra's doing, what Kellanova's doing in terms of the farmers they have in their supply chain to do this. Wherever that can be done, I think we want to encourage that. I think one of the things that comes back to what I said earlier, we've got to think about this net zero. it can be easy to go from 30% to 5%, and it's the last 5 to 0 that can be really, really, really hard. And we've got to think about how much effort we need to put in to actually get there, and is it this particular industry sector we need to do that on, or do we work on something else? And so we can't think of that being as a failure, but it's important, I think, for farmers to understand what their baseline is so they know, are they continuing to improve? Because the things they do will actually be improving if they're doing those good sustainable practices. In the end, are we going to get to net zero everywhere? Probably not, because some of them are going to be really, really hard. We shouldn't punish ourselves for that, because we may be actually making great successes in other areas.
So just another comment, Katie. I think there's probably going to be a market eventually for low carbon crops. It's not there today, and I don't think there's a definition of what a low carbon crop is, but I think farmers are starting to recognise that that's an opportunity for them. How they prove that their crop is low carbon will be a lot of the work that we're trying to implement with them right now around developing their baseline on what their GHG emissions look like, and then how do they get their practices to help keep driving it down. It could be a government number that comes up to be called low carbon. I don't know. I don't have that answer for you today, but I think that's where it will head to. Because right now the consumer will not pay for responsibly and sustainably sourced crops. They won't pay for it. They expect us, the manufacturer, and everybody else in the supply chain to absorb the costs, unfortunately, and not pass them up the chain. But I'm hoping, really, that there is a reward eventually for low carbon crops, because I think that's the ultimate goal for our farmers.
During this discussion of sustainability, it's important to note that what sustainability means to the panellists here individually, but as a sector, could be very different to the consumer, to governments globally, how it's defined in policy domestically and abroad. Chris, I'm keen to hear from you, as a global company, what is the definition of sustainability if there was a common thread globally in the application of ESG for your company?
Wow. So as a company, we have adopted, we've got our own SBTI targets, our science-based targets, as part of our commitments to 25% reduction at the end of this year, and then 100% reduction by 2050. So, and we work within the framework of the SBTI targets, which take in the SDGs as part of that. We have an overarching set of targets as a global business, but there will be nuances in different markets and in different countries due to maybe their maturity and what they're able to do. So if I go to an example, if I want to go to do some work with my Thailand work streams, they don't actually have emission factors set up yet. So for me to actually understand what my numbers look like coming out of Thailand, I don't really know. I've got to go and use the global numbers. So it does sort of flow down to country by country in some respects, but as a company, as a global company, we have our global commitments, we have our global SBTI targets, and we have our global SDGs that we work within. So we're very fixed within what they look like.
So it's fair to say that's quite a complex space to play in.
Very much so.
And could be very consuming for the average person.
It's very consuming for us, and we work in it, trust me. Because I guess at the moment globally, there's not a consensus, 100% consensus on what greenhouse gas emission measurement looks like, what is the overarching numbers that we should be developing, and what is the right way of doing it. It's still in a bit of a state of flux. It's getting there. It's better than it was 2 years ago, but even for us who work in it all the time, it's horrendously confusing. And I know enough to get myself into a lot of trouble, so I'm not going to say a lot more. But it is, all I can say is it's in a state of flux, Kate, and globally, we're all still struggling with it. Whether it's us, whether it's Kraft, whether it's Nestle, whether it's PepsiCo, we're all struggling with it.
I want to bring in Angela here because I know that you were on an earlier panel which talked about social license, which is also a big part of ESG. We haven't had a chance to really get into that on this panel, and we've only got a little bit of time. But if you can touch on that you made a comment in that earlier panel. It was one of your last remarks saying that, the industry really needs somewhat of a trusted media watch type figure. Now, I sat there and immediately said, is that not Sue McCluskey?
Done and dusted.
So I'm going to throw to Sue after this, because as if there's not enough in her role already, to hear, I guess, her take on, what that trusted voice looks like for this industry.
Yeah, I'm a really strong believer of finding the unicorn who has the potential to reset that storytelling. We always talk about telling stories better. The sustainability story does mean different things to different people. I simplify it to the basis, which is understanding something, insert ocean, for example, using wisely, And then for today and tomorrow, there's like a real simplistic piece, and that's probably been my whole career motto. I did steal it from the National Oceans Office before they got abolished, but it came in at a particular time. The ability for someone who is trusted enough by government, by industry, by community, by consumers to tell a story where a lot of people are too busy, they outsource trust to supermarkets and retailers. Like a sticker can equal enough for trust, potentially, or it cannot. But the ability to then, when there is claims being made by interest groups, particularly who are quite active in opposition, they're not going to listen to a lot of people. This trusted voice who has a role in our society and can test things and have a pool of experts behind them that they can draw from and help us reshape, because right now that disconnect between our food systems and our consumers is so big, and it has such a threat to us. So whether it's Sue, whether it's the unicorn, I am up for it. I genuinely am.
And I guess it's really important, before I throw to Sue, it's not the government or the industry that gets to determine if you're meeting the expectation of social licence.
Yeah.
That's the general public.
Yeah.
Over to you, Sue. Is that within your remit?
Well, thank you for the trust and belief in me, but there is only one of me, and I am part-time. Look, it's a shared responsibility. It's really incumbent upon all of us to be part of this. And I keep saying in this role, it'd be great if there were 10 of me, but how do I share the love, and how do I pull on different networks around the world and make sure that I can involve other people? And every time I go to an event, speak at a conference, go to a meeting, I'm taken aback by just the wealth of experience, knowledge, innovation that's actually happening here. The thing I constantly say, though, is we keep talking to ourselves. All of you in this room are here because you're interested in agriculture, agri-food systems, innovation in the ag sector. We've got to get mainstream, and that's where we're really going to help with our social licence, because we've really got to be talking the language of the kids. When I hear stories that kids don't want to eat red meat or chocolate because it's bad for the environment, someone's got into that primary school and told them that. We've got to be getting in there. We've got to be getting out in the community, be honest about what we do, but actually tell the story and dispel the myths and get the facts out there. And that's for all of us to do. And I keep saying we've got to get into things like the Women's Weekly and the Herald Times and we've got to be mainstream.
So from that, I take that we need a healthy and robust media landscape, which, as the journalist, I would love to see that. That also requires funding and opportunity. So maybe another strategy that we'll take from this session. I would love to keep the conversation going, but I'm very conscious of the time and the fact that it has been a big 2 days of this conference. I've really spruiked the afternoon tea. So I I've got to get everybody to afternoon tea. But before I do that, a sincere thanks to all of the panellists. We've heard this afternoon from Dr. Will Chancellor, Richard Heath joining us online, Angela Williamson, Sue McCluskey, and Chris Stevens. Thank you to the delegates who have joined us online. I guess just to put a thread around this conference, there's been a lot of discussion. We've heard about the challenges, but there's opportunity in those challenges, and that although globally there is geopolitical tension and a disruption like we've not seen in our lifetime, there is still agency. We've heard that trust underpins not just our human-to-human interaction, but it is also a key factor of the data that we use, the application and the use of technology and tools. And in this session, we've closed out with the importance of social license. So I think it's fair to say that across all of the discussions that we've had throughout this conference, everybody will take from Sue her wise words that we are not going to live in this echo chamber of a captive audience. It's everybody's responsibility, and I look forward to hearing you continue talking about agriculture. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate.